So January, February reading is done for the most part. There is one book I will show you that I have to read. I'm going to not talk about all the books I want to read in March. And it's almost as if it's a law of reader nature to pick a set of books that are way too big to actually finish in the allotted period of time you have made for them. Basically saying that my reading list is probably going to be way too big for me. But you know that it's part of the game, right? That's part of what you do as a reader. You make reading lists too big. Aim for the moon, aim for the stars, land on the moon. Is that it? Yeah. So let's actually look at the books that I am going to read. The first one is actually a book I've been reading, and it's part of February's reading list. It's the last one I was supposed to read in February. I didn't finish it in time. It's Psychotherapy of the Disorders of the Self. It's basically like like a psychoanalysis book. Did I talk about this elsewhere? I feel like I talked about this book recently. I'm still reading it. This guy has his own approach to psychotherapy. It's called the Masterson's approach. And it's interesting so far. He's applying it to personality disorders. He also has another book called The Real Self, where it's just his conception of the self, but not applied to personality disorders. It's fun read. It's an interesting book. Not supposed to be on my March reading list, but it's there because I didn't finish all the books I was supposed to read in February. The next book that I'm going to read is not a book I'm super hyped for, and the title is misleading. So if you've read if you read like Antonio Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, there is a topic that gets debated in this field, and it's basically the ontology of reason and emotion. Are they separate? Are they the same? Antonio Damasio takes the position that they aren't separate, that they're the same, that they're not separable inside the brain, that the functions responsible, or the neural mechanisms responsible for these functions are nearly the same, if not identical. Some philosophers say reason and emotion are separate, that rationality is not the same thing as emotionality. Emotionality is not a word, just emotion. But this book doesn't do that, actually. This book is more about how reason is applied to emotional life. So I think you could actually argue it takes the presupposition that they're separate and ignores any kind of arguments to say that they're separate. The reason I'm reading this book is not because I think it's going to be a terrific book, however, it is because I am writing a book right now. I have 71,000 words out of 90,000. And I wanted to add a chapter that discusses rationality and emotion, because the book is a general meditations about life. It's 22 essays right now. It's ideally going to be 25. And I feel like I should talk about this topic. It's a topic that's so frequently mentioned in psychology, philosophy, even in economics. People talk about this stuff. I feel like I should probably bring it up, right? At least once. Like, I feel like a well-rounded writer would deal with this topic at least once. So that's my intention. I'm going to use this as a way to structure my thoughts. Don't expect a review for this. I'll probably talk about it, but don't expect a review for this. The next one is Political Modernization in Japan and Turkey. This is actually a journal. I don't know, it's not a journal. It's just a bunch of writers. It's a bunch of writers in one little put together book. Halil Inalcik is in here. I don't know if I said his name right. Every time I try and pronounce his name, it's a bit different each time. So I think the idea behind this book is to compare modernization in Japan and Turkey. There are a lot of, obviously, comparisons or similarities between Japan and Turkey. They both came from empires. They both formed modern nation states. They've both dealt with, I guess you could say, political instability. What else? They both have an important naval influence on their neighboring countries. There's so many comparisons you can make between them, and this book I think is going to go and do that in different areas, but in specific as it relates to modernization. I'm going to review this book, so I'll let you know how it goes. It's going to be a difficult book to review since there's so many different chapters and sections. I think there's like 10 sections and then like there's a chapter for each section. So we'll see how this book goes. The next one is Daniel Dennett's Bacteria to Bach and Bach, The Evolution of Mind. So when this book first came out, I really wanted to read it. I held off from reading it because I want to say I've read like 65% of Daniel Dennett. 65 or 70. I have a lot of his books, and I've even read a lot of his papers. So I am of the belief that the contents of this book will not be vastly different from the contents of his other books, and therefore I will not gain too much new information from this book. Or when I say information, I mean like just new viewpoints. I feel like there's going to be a repetition in viewpoints here. This happens a lot with like Joseph, what is his name? George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. There we go. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. If you just read Philosophy of the Flesh, then you don't need to read Metaphors We Live By. You don't even need to read Mathematics Embodied or any of his other books. You could just read that one book because the viewpoints are so similar. So as a result, I've been holding off on reading this book. I do want to write a chapter in my book, however, about the relationship between natural selection and consciousness, and whether it's like the subjective, because in philosophy there's this idea that subjectivity is the basis of all knowledge, and you can ask an interesting question about bidirectionality here, whether it's like conscious experiences shape our theory of natural selection, or is it that natural selection shapes our conscious experiences? You can ask about the directionality of this relationship, and this book I feel like will help me structure my thoughts about that a little bit more. I know that this book isn't a phenomenology book, and what I'm writing about is kind of phenomenology, but he does talk about things like emergence. I think he compares roaches to, for example, human architects, and how they come up. There's such vast differences in what they are, but the outputs that they produce can be very similar. I think there was in specific a roach house, hive, whatever, that was built in South America that looks very much like a cathedral that was built in Italy. So there's comparisons to be made there. That could be interesting. At any rate, I'll review this book. I'll let you guys know what I think of it. Next one is The Moral Animal by Robert Wright. I've held off on all of Robert Wright's works because in university, I spent a lot of time studying evolutionary psychology. It was probably like the primary source that I was the primary field that I was reading for maybe 3 years, 3 to 4. I spent a lot of time reading David M. Buss, Toby, I think that's how you pronounce it, Toby and Cosmides. I actually read their PhD thesis as well on their Darwinian social exchange mechanism. It's actually an interesting thesis. I've read Pinker, Dawkins. There's some other researchers I can't remember. There's the guy who does the evolutionary psychology and marketing. I can't remember his name, but he has a YouTube channel. I've also I printed a lot of papers and read on the subject. I was really, really burnt out of evolutionary psychology, and the problem with this guy, I think, is it's not that his books are bad. I actually think his books are going to be great. The problem might be is because it's a general audience book, it will be a little bit basic, and because it's so basic, it will be like very repetitive for me. I have a suspicion that the reason, like the argument he's going to make, is something that is commonly made in evolutionary psychology, namely that there are brain mechanisms responsible for certain sets of behaviors and cognitions that could be reasonably labeled as morality. And then there are forms of organization that are universal across cultures. There was a book called Human Universals by Dan Brown where he makes an inventory of all these things that humans do consistently, no matter the culture that they're in. And something like, for example, family organization or language or the concept of property, something like this, will be used to argue that there's a human nature that produces the family unit, the family organization. And since there seems to be consistent sets of behaviors associated with family, that could be argued to be a morality or a human morality, a human nature of morality, something like this. That's what my suspicion that this book is going to be doing, and since I'm already so familiar with all these arguments, it will be a little bit boring. I will review this, and I will see. I do want to read all of Robert Wright. I just wanted to take a little bit longer of a break. I do the same thing with neuroscience. I spent so much time reading neuroscience that I've kind of held off on reading for the last 3 to 4 years reading any neuroscience books. The last one is a fiction book. I intend to actually produce more fiction book videos because I think I also pick interesting fiction books. This one is a metafiction book, and like the idea that there are philosophical or psychological truths inside the book that you have to interpret from the stories, kind of like what you would do with Dostoevsky. And this one covers a middle-class laborer in Japan. It's a woman who commits a crime. I think she murders someone. But the reasons why she kills someone, I believe, was out of societal pressures. And so I think it's a commentary. I have the impression that there's a commentary on the psychological impacts caused by the pressures of Japanese society. That was the kind of idea I had in this book, and that's what it's going to talk about. Because if you look at like even Japan's like average work hours per week, they have one of the highest in the developed world, right? I think it's like 38 per week. And I think the Nordic countries are like 31, 32, depending on which one. And then America's like 34. I think Canada's like 34, 33 as well. And people have been trying to push it down lower to about 31 to 32. I think that's what has been considered centrist or reasonable. So this book is going to cover some of these things that go on in Japan through fiction. It's a metafiction book. The last one is a cinematography textbook. I started reading this book a long time ago, and I got to the halfway point, and then I stopped reading it because it got into technical stuff about cinematography, such as cameras, sensors, dollies, etc. Nothing against that. I didn't want to get into cinematography to that level of specificity. However, there are other chapters in here that talk about color theory that I haven't gotten to, stuff like that. So I do need to finish this book. I do want to finish it this month. And I have other textbooks on film that I want to read. And to be honest, what I like about reading film books and photography books is it changes like consumption of movies or television from a passive activity to an active activity, which is much more enjoyable. So if you're watching a movie, and let's say you haven't read anything about theory of film or anything like that, then you might not even notice that there's a color grading on the movie, on the entire movie, which adds to a kind of aesthetic, it adds an aesthetic quality to the movie, and you can kind of theorize what the aim was if you have some background knowledge or exposure to theorizing about film. You could notice different angles were being taken for different reasons. You could notice even the arrangement of sets and how sometimes the camera will zoom in on a set to get a closer shot. It gives a different impression, versus if it's farther away, it gives a different impression. The kind of the depth of the shot. There's lots of things that you can comment on and notice if you have the exposure and the jargon, I would say, to actually understand what's being talked about or being shown on screen. So it's a much more active process that way. So that's why I want to get back into reading this stuff, especially this textbook. I feel like this textbook, once it got to the technical stuff, it got deterred. But I have so many other books that I want to read on this topic. So I need to finish this one. So that is my reading list. That is my reading list for March. It is definitely ambitious, way too ambitious. I feel like I would be surprised if I actually finished these. I wouldn't be surprised if I didn't finish these, especially because I want to finish writing my book. But if you guys have books that you want me to review in specific, let me know. I haven't been able to start my other 2023 reading goals because I've simply been chasing things that I should have finished last year. I should have finished my second book last year. I should have fixed my stock portfolio last year. I spent January and February working on stocks. I should have finished that last year. There's so many things I should have finished, and as a result, I haven't been able to start my 2023 goals. I do want to continue with like the underrated, overrated books, content, the one book of history per country. I have a Bertrand Russell and Carl Jung reading list that I want to get through. I have so many things I want to do this year that I at least want to start. They're going to be like 2 or 3 year goals, but I'm still finishing up last year's projects, which is why I have a new reading list this month. Anyways, if you guys have specific books you want me to read and review, I'm totally open to doing that. Just give me some time, I'll get to it. Just let me know below. And with that being said, bye bye.